that Biden's first budget request included $14 billion in annual spending to address climate, including a promise to spend 40% of those dollars in communities that are disproportionately impacted by climate change. And that request also proposed that $800 billion be spent in the next decade for clean energy technologies to make a national goal of a 50% reduction by 2030. On the state level, there are several climate-related bills that passed during this legislative session, and I'm putting this slide up here to show that the state also has significant climate goals as well. So there are a number of goals that passed during the last legislative session. One was holding companies accountable for reducing their fluorinated gas emissions, which are a greenhouse gas, reducing the carbon intensity of transportation fuels by 20%, and setting a goal for all new vehicle sales in Washington to be electric by 2030. And that's one that local Rep. Rammel was key on in creating. And we also created a cap and trade legislation for Washington. One of the pieces of landmark legislation that was passed is the HEAL Act, which will help Washington State begin to bring environmental and climate policy and practices in line with climate justice principles to make sure we're protecting those who are most affected by environmental degradation, environmental pollution. And so all of these are in line with the governor's goal of reducing carbon pollution over 50% in the next 9 years. Oops. In terms of our own climate goals, we set a baseline in 2000. That's our first greenhouse gas inventory. The last greenhouse gas inventory we had in 2015 showed about a 6% drop from our baseline in 2000. Our next goals include a 20% drop by 2020, 28% drop by 2020, a 40% in 2030, and 85% in 2050. Those are our goals for the community. You'll notice that one of the goals that we don't have information yet on is 2020. We're working on a greenhouse gas inventory for 2020 now, and we hope to have that done by the end of the year, so we'll know where we stand on that data point. So there's a lot of work in the U.S. happening right now, and on the federal, on the state and local level, and it's my perspective that these different spheres of activity, and not just from the federal level on down, that there's some really nice interplay between these three, and that leadership from cities in the U.S. has really emboldened both state and federal governments to do their work. My experience is that states end up looking at small cities or larger cities that are doing something. They get emboldened to say, well, let's make it statewide, and the federal government can do the same thing with states who have taken on certain legislation. So that's why it's so key that we have important work done here at the local level. In terms of national statistics, those say that it's a good time to be working on this issue of climate change. This is info from the Yale program on climate change communications, which says that over half of Americans describe themselves as alarmed or concerned relative to climate change, while doubtful and dismissive Americans are under a quarter. Nationally, Latinx and Black Americans are more likely to be alarmed or concerned than whites, and are also more likely to join a campaign to convince elected officials to reduce global warming. And climate change, as we know, is likely to be felt disproportionately by those who already suffer economic inequalities. People of color in the U.S. are found to be particularly more vulnerable to heat waves, extreme weather events, environmental degradation, and labor market dislocations that stem from these other outcomes of climate change. So we'll move on to into the implementation plan, and those items that we pulled from the Climate Action Plan and from the Climate Action Task Force into this year's Climate Action Plan implementation plan. Remember, that's what we're working on for this year. So we're going to move into some highlights on that plan, and I'll separate them out by area of effort. So in this is not everything that the city staff are engaged in, but these are highlights, and I'm happy to answer some detailed questions later. So on the renewable energy end, we are pursuing procurement of low carbon electricity for the entire Bellingham community. The city government has done this. They are contracted with PSE for delivery of low carbon electricity to the grid in our name. And we want to do that times way more for all of the power that comes into the Bellingham community. This is one action that could drop our emissions by over a third with just one program. PSC is working on this right now. They've sent out a request for proposals. They have received those in and now are looking through those proposals to see if they can find someone who may be able to supply Bellingham and a few other cities the level of power that we're looking for. So we'll hope to have more information on this near the end of the year. On another note, on a much more minor level, Bellingham will be hosting a new community solar array, which is also in partnership with PSE, which will produce enough electricity for about 50 average homes in Bellingham. Two other cities, I think was Anacortes, and there's one more, have opened up community solar opportunities. So essentially you apply to buy shares in community solar, and then you reap the rewards of that share. If the sun's out, you get a reduction in your power bill. If it's not so bright out, then you've got to pay a little bit more. But it's essentially, I believe it's $20 per share per month on top of your bill to make it happen. So we'd really like to see something that allows that power, that sort of power to be used by anyone. And this is the idea behind community solar. And PSE is holding a number of these shares for folks in the low-income community. So everybody has the chance to benefit from this. So very, very small amount of power. We want to really expand it through other work, but it's a start. Last thing in renewable energy, we are working with the city and port on a biomass boiler for the waterfront. Everyone's heard of the waterfront development down there. The default at that development was a natural gas system to provide heating. And we're working with folks down there for a biomass boiler. It could also be an electric heat pump system as well. But at least the biomass boiler would show about a 60% reduction in carbon emissions from the power plant over natural gas. And again, we're working with the port and Corix, who's the utility down there, on that item. We really want to make sure that that waterfront shines as a beacon of low carbon development. Within energy efficiency, we're looking into programs that will help existing homes in Bellingham to lower their carbon emissions through efficiency incentives and requirements. One technology that's key to this process are heat pumps that use electricity as fuel versus natural gas. And we are just about ready to sign a contract with Sustainable Connections for a event during Climate Week, a heat pump campaign where we're wanting to get people to convert their electric or natural gas water heaters to heat pump water heaters. And you should see more about that here in the next month. Likely that'll be initiated during Climate Week, which is September 20th through the 26th. It's a very small pilot, but we're hoping to learn a lot from that pilot and expand that program. Ultimately, we'd love to have a lot of money available for incentives for folks of all income ranges to be able to convert their space and water heating equipment that's natural gas to heat pumps that use electricity. And why that's important is because the grid is greening. We know that through the Clean Energy Transformation Act, PSC will be required to, over time, lower the carbon content of that electricity. So that makes it even more important to get our utilities, or to get our appliances from using natural gas to electricity. By 2030, that carbon will be that electricity will be 80% carbon free. And then by 2050 will be 100% renewable. That's state law. that will be happening. We'll see if the utilities are able to do that. It's a really tall order for them, but they are required by state law to do those sorts of things. On the transportation end of things, we're right now we have a project to implement EV charging across town. We received a $1.5 million grant from the Department of Commerce, and we matched that with $500,000 from the voter approved transportation fund. So folks that voted for that, thank you. That's allowing for EV charging to happen here in Bellingham. We'll add 90 new level 2 and level 3 chargers across town. So if you have an EV, you'll be able to go to public areas and charge your car. There are a number of people who don't have the ability to charge at home. This will allow them to park at a park or another area and charge their car. On the green building end of things, this is one of the biggest items on my plate, which is electrification of new buildings. We are conducting research and working with stakeholders such as the BIA of Whatcom County in pursuit of an all-electric ordinance for new commercial and large multifamily buildings. State law precludes us from saying that all residential buildings will be built all electric, but it does allow for commercial and large multifamily buildings to be built all electric, or I should say, allows us to create local building codes that say thou shalt build all electric in these areas. So Seattle in February adopted an energy code that mandates that all commercial and large multifamily buildings be built all electric, and do a number of other things, including having envelope improvements, be solar ready, all sorts of different bells and whistles there. And we're working on that right now. Planning and community development within city government just hired on an additional person to assist with this. We're going to have another person on board, and hopefully this item will be coming back to city council here before the end of the year, and we'll be asking for city council to approve an ordinance that would mandate all electric commercial and large multifamily buildings. Another item that's happened of late that's really exciting is a partnership between Bellingham and the county government on adoption of a clean energy financing program called CPACER. That's a program for commercial buildings and large multifamily buildings in Whatcom County, where they can apply for lower interest rate loans for efficiency work, solar work, resiliency work on those buildings, and have that loan be something that doesn't show up on the owner's balance sheet. So there's less chance that it would affect loaning capability. It's basically a lien that stays with the building, not with the loaner. So not with the owner, I should say. And so we're hoping to really make use of that. We were the first county in Washington State to adopt that program that was made possible by state legislation. On the land use end of things, we're pushing for high density development broadly, and specifically in our residential multifamily zones. And the idea here is that we want people to be able to live near where they work. And that means less car traffic. That means people can walk to the grocery store, all sorts of things. Council is going to hold a public hearing and do work sessions on proposed regulations in this sphere in the early fall. On the waste end of things, we don't really have a whole lot on the waste and the waste side of things here in 2021. There is consideration of moving the city from a multi-bin recycling system to a single stream, simply because one of the studies that we looked at showed about a third drop in carbon emissions a drop of 1/3 in carbon emissions from multi-stream to single stream. So from multiple bins to one bin, because of the increased recycling with one bin. Now, that study didn't take into account all the developments that have happened in the waste world, such as the China sword policy that's come out of China, but that's one thing that we're looking into, is a conversion of that system. And in our other category, we are pursuing creation of a clean energy fund for a vote in 2022. The idea behind this at this point, and it's in a very draft state, is that we would be asking for a either property tax increase or a tax on natural gas to the natural gas company, not on users of natural gas, although users will likely end up paying more if the company itself was taxed, in order to create a fund that would help us to put money into weatherization, electrification, all of the things that we need to do within the plan. That clean energy fund we're hoping would be on the ballot in 2022, November of 2022. So, as we're moving, that's the update on the implementation plan right there. And as we're moving into 2022 now, we're already starting to plan on creation of an implementation, starting to work on creation of the implementation plan for 2022. And public input won't be the sole determining factor on what we do next year. But as I was talking about with Judy and other folks on the call, that it does count. And so if you have ideas on what it is you would like us to focus in on, you can provide those to me, you can provide those to your elected officials, and that will be a component of how we make a decision on what it is that we spend our limited staff time on in 2022. I'll end with a few things here. Where our strengths, opportunities, and threats lie. I think on the strengths end of things, we have a strong community interest kind of crystallized in this meeting here with all of the wonderful folks that are on this call, and that includes our elected. So strong, community interest. There's lots of local, regional, national, global activity, and other than the advent of a pandemic, there's no better time to make progress on climate right now. The stars have aligned. We really are in a sweet spot for that. On opportunities, I mentioned the $14 billion in new spending proposed by the president in this request to spend $800 billion more over the coming decade. If this level of funding takes place, we are going to need to be staffed appropriately to make use of those funds. And it's something that I've talked with other folks about. If grants are great, but you have to have people that have the time to apply for the grant, and then also have time to shepherd that grant through the implementation process once you receive the money. And that's something that we'll need to do. On the threat end, we know that no matter what we do here locally, we're going to be facing a changing climate due to the warming that's already happened. So that the way that I look at this is sort of, I think of a pond, right? And rocks dropped into a pond. The effects of climate change are those waves hitting the shore where we're standing. The waves that are hitting the shore now are partly due to rocks that were dropped some time ago. We can completely stop dropping those rocks in the water and we will still feel the effects of those waves, if that makes sense to people. So our role right now is to shrink the size of the rocks that we're dropping in the pond. But even if we stop throwing them, we will still feel the effects of that effort. And that's, everyone, I think, should be aware of that. And in that really focuses our attention on not only mitigation, reducing carbon emissions, but also adaptation and looking at what it's going to take to live in a world where we're going to have increased warming, more extreme weather, as we're seeing in New York today, and the heat dome that we had. All of those things are at least partly, if not primarily, associated with those rocks that we've dropped already. So that's something that we're trying to wrap our minds around, is what do we need as a city? Cooling shelters for sure, and other ways to adapt, especially given that certain folks in the city have less ability to keep themselves safe in extreme weather event. And we need to make sure that those folks are put first on the list. Mm. So that's just about it to me. I'll mention this just finally, that there's in terms of statistics, we've had 600 climate action plans have been published nationally. Given that there are 19,000, 20,000 incorporated places in the US, so cities, villages, towns, that means that 3% of US communities have a climate action plan. We can have a more reasonable statistic there and kind of pull out the 16,000 localities that are under 10,000 people. So leave all those 10,000 plus populations. That's 3,100 communities or 16% of the US population or 16% of cities that have a climate action plan. And then noting even further that a much smaller portion of local governments have trackable, quantifiable measures in their caps. Most just have these really high level goals, and fewer have great implementation strategies like our own. So this is just to say that Bellingham is really in the vanguard. And what we do here is meaningful for the rest of the world. And what we are successful on and what we fail on will help other people to do their part. And so it's my perspective that if we're going to take our leadership role seriously, that our timeline and our efforts need to take into consideration the time or the fact that others will undoubtedly lag behind us. And then we should be giving them the time they need to catch up and meet their own climate targets. So it puts even more pressure on us to get moving and have some successes that can be shared with other people. But that does give us a chance to be the leader that we see ourselves being. Well, that's it. That's my presentation here. I've taken a lot more than my 10 or 15 minutes. So look forward to your comments, your questions, and I will try. And I know there's probably a lot there. I'll give maybe a more concise answer. And if people want to follow up later on with questions, then we'll do that. Just want to make sure everyone has a chance to ask at least one question. So I might kind of bob around. And Jane, if you want to manage that, feel free. If you want me to do that, I'm happy to do that as well. But I'll stop sharing my screen. And thanks for listening to me for so long. Appreciate your time.